The smoke rose from the hillside every morning, thin, gray, steady as a heartbeat. It came from nowhere. No cabin, no structure, no sign that any living creature had touched that frozen ground. Just a pale thread of smoke rising from the dead grass of Harper's Ridge, drifting up into the white Nebraska sky and disappearing like it had never been there at all. Commissioner Aldous Prentice had walked that hillside twice already. He was a big man, broad across the shoulders, the kind of man who had built Millhaven from a trading post into something resembling a town. He did not believe in things he could not explain. He did not believe in mysteries. He believed in property lines and ordinances and the natural order of things, and the natural order of things did not include smoke rising from empty ground. He stood on the crest of Harper's Ridge that November morning, his boots crunching through the thin crust of early snow, and he looked out across the frozen grassland and felt something he rarely felt: doubt. Below him, 15 feet below the frozen ground on which he stood, Sigrid Enberg lay in her bed and listened to him walk across her roof. She did not move. She did not breathe more than she had to. She lay on her back in the dark and counted his footsteps, heavy, deliberate, the footsteps of a man who believed the ground belonged to him, and she waited. The candle on her shelf had been out for an hour. She had heard the horses coming from half a mile away. She had extinguished the flame, set down the moccasin she had been restitching, and lain down on her bed with her hands folded on her stomach and her eyes open in the complete dark. She had learned in 6 weeks of living inside this hill that darkness was not something to be feared. Darkness was simply the absence of light. It had no opinion about her. It made no judgments. It did not tell her she was living like an animal or wandering the prairie without a plan. It simply held her the way the earth held her, without condition. Prentice took 4 more steps, stopped, took 2 steps back, stood still for a long moment directly above her head, 15 feet of packed earth between them. Sigrid counted to 60, then to 60 again. She thought about the construction of the ceiling above her, the cottonwood beams she had cut herself, hauled 3 miles from the creek on her back, in loads she had sized carefully so she would not leave drag marks in the dirt. The sod blocks laid over those beams in tight interlocking courses, the way Einar had shown her, each block cut to the same dimensions so the joints would be staggered and strong. The layer of dead grass packed over the sod, then the natural topsoil replaced on top of that, tamped down and raked smooth, seeded with the dried grass she had saved from her first excavation so it would look undisturbed by spring. 15 feet, 5 layers of material. Visible. Prentice moved again, 2 steps south, pausing, then 3 steps east. He was working a grid, she realized. He was methodical. She gave him credit for that, and at least he was not a man who gave up quickly. He was a man who believed that if something existed, he could find it by applying sufficient order to the search. What he did not understand, what he could not understand because no one had taught him, was that the thing he was looking for had been built by someone who knew exactly how men like him searched. She heard him say something to the men with him. She could not make out the words from this depth, just the tone, that particular flat, dismissive tone of a man who has decided to be done with something. Then the footsteps moved away, back toward the horses, the sound of boots on frozen ground growing fainter, then the creak of saddle leather, then hooves moving south toward Millhaven. She lay there in the dark for another 10 minutes without moving. She had learned this too, that patience after danger is as important as patience during it, that the impulse to move, to breathe freely, to reach for the candle the moment a threat passes, is exactly the impulse that gets people caught. Real safety is not the absence of danger. Real safety is the certainty that the danger has passed completely and will not return in the next 5 minutes because you moved too soon. She counted to 600, 10 minutes, 1 second at a time. Then she reached up and lit the candle. The flame caught. The small room around her came back into being, the earthen walls smooth and slightly damp, holding their temperature with a steadiness that no wood frame building in Millhaven could match. The wooden shelf along the east wall lined with her preserves. The iron stove in the corner, still breathing out its quiet warmth from the banked fire she had reduced to coals before she heard the horses. The ceiling of packed sod and cottonwood beams, dark and solid above her head. The temperature in the room was 55 degrees. Outside it was 12 below zero and falling towards something worse. Sigrid Enberg was 17 years old. She had been living inside this hill for 6 weeks, and Aldous Prentice had just stood on her roof and never known she was there. She lay there a moment longer in the candlelight, looking up at the ceiling, listening to the silence that had returned. The deep, total silence of a room surrounded on all sides by earth, a silence with no wind in it, no creak of wood, no sound of the cold working at the gaps in a structure that was never meant to face this kind of winter. Then she sat up, reached for the moccasin she had set down, and went back to work. She had not always been this way. Quiet, still, patient as the ground beneath her. There had been a time not even a year ago, though it felt like another life entirely, when she had been simply a girl. A Norwegian girl on the Nebraska prairie, the daughter of Halvard Enberg, helping her father mend fences, and tend the horses, and cook the evening meal, and do the 10,000 small things that kept a homestead alive through a season. She had not been unhappy in that life. She had not been afraid. That was before the horse spooked. Halvard Enberg died on a Tuesday in late September, killed by a rattlesnake that appeared without warning on the South Trail, and a horse that had never been skittish in its 9 years of working life, but chose that one moment, that single unrepeatable second of startled instinct, to throw the man on its back with enough force to break something that could not be unbroken. He was dead before anyone found him. The snake was gone. The horse had run 2 miles before stopping, and when the Hofstetter boy brought it back that evening, it was calm and untroubled, its eyes clear with no comprehension of what it had done. Halvard had been 48 years old. He had brought Sigrid to America from Norway when she was 6 years old, just the two of them crossing on a ship that took 3 weeks and smelled of salt and unwashed bodies. And something else she could not name then, but understood later, was the smell of people who had left everything behind and did not know if what waited at the other end was better or worse. Her mother had died the winter before. There had been nothing left in Norway to hold them. Halvard had built his homestead on the Nebraska plain with his own hands, starting with what he could afford and adding to it year by year with a particular Norwegian stubbornness that does not call itself stubbornness, but simply work. He had bought his land properly, filed his claims at the county seat, planted his fields in the rotation that Einar Volstad had recommended, and raised his daughter to know the difference between what you could control and what you could not, and more importantly, to focus your energy entirely on the former and spend no time lamenting the latter. He had been a careful man, a practical man, a man who prepared for what he could see coming and accepted what he could not. He had also, in the one significant failure of judgment in his life, married Dorothy. Dorothy Enberg had come into their lives 3 years before Halvard died. She was a Danish woman, solid, capable, not unintelligent, and not, when you first met her, obviously unkind. She had qualities that looked on the surface like the qualities a practical man in a hard country would value: efficiency, reserve, a lack of sentimentality that could be mistaken for strength. What she also had, and what Sigrid had noticed from the first week and never been able to name precisely, was a quality of watchfulness that had nothing to do with care. A way of taking in a room, its people, its contents, its arrangements, that was less like observation and more like inventory. A way of listening to a conversation that made you feel somehow that she was not listening to the words so much as assessing what the words revealed about the balance of things. She had been pleasant enough while Halvard was alive. Not warm, Dorothy was not a warm woman, but functional. She did her work. She ran the house efficiently. She did not interfere with the relationship between Halvard and his daughter, which meant she kept her distance from it, which Sigrid had been grateful for, without knowing how much that distance would cost her when Halvard was gone. 3 days after his funeral, Sigrid found out. They were sitting at the kitchen table, the table Halvard had built himself from cottonwood and iron fittings. He had ordered from a catalog, the table that had been the center of every meal. Sigrid could remember every conversation, every quiet evening, with a book while her father worked through the accounts. Dorte sat across from her with her hands folded on the tabletop in front of her and looked at Sigrid with the expression of a woman conducting a business transaction she finds neither pleasant nor unpleasant, but simply necessary. "The law is clear on this," she said. "A widow inherits. The homestead is mine. The land is mine. The livestock is mine. The contents of the house are mine." She paused. "You are not my daughter. You are not my blood relation of any kind. You are not my legal responsibility. I have no obligation to house you or feed you beyond what common decency requires in the immediate period following your father's death." Sigrid said nothing. Outside the window, the wind moved through the dead grass of the yard with a low, continuous sound like something breathing. A horse shifted in the barn. Her father's horse, though it was no longer her father's horse, because her father's horse was now Dorothy's horse, because everything was now Dorothy's, everything. The clock on the mantel ticked with the same steady indifference it had always shown to everything that happened in its presence. "I am telling you this plainly," Dorothy continued, "because I believe plain is better than pretending. It would be easier for me, perhaps, to pretend that this conversation is not necessary, to let you continue to live here for another month, another 2 months, until the situation resolves itself in whatever way it resolves itself. But I think that would be unkind in a deeper sense than the kindness it appears to offer." Sigrid looked at her across the table, at the folded hands, at the expression that was not cruel exactly and was not indifferent exactly, but was something more precise than either the expression of someone who has thought through a situation carefully and arrived at a conclusion and is now simply communicating that conclusion with as little friction as possible. "When should I leave?" Sigrid asked. Dorothy blinked, just once quickly in the way of someone who is braced for a different response and must now recalibrate. She had expected perhaps tears, the kind of scene that would have put Dorothy in the position of offering some small concession, an extra week, a small portion of the food stores, some token of generosity that would allow her to feel reasonable while still getting what she wanted. She had prepared for negotiation. She was not getting negotiation. "End of the week," Dorothy said. Sigrid nodded. She stood up from the table. She walked to her room, a small room at the back of the house that had been hers since she was 6 years old, with the window that faced east, so she had always woken up to the morning light coming in first. And she sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the wall and thought with the particular clarity that comes when emotion has been set aside entirely in favor of necessity about what she was going to do. She thought about it for a long time. By morning, she had a direction. The town of Millhaven saw her leave on a Friday morning. She walked out of the homestead that had been her father's with a canvas pack on her back, containing everything she had decided to take her warmest clothes. Her father's wool coat, which was too large for her, but warmer than anything she owned. A small knife, a fire striker, 3 days of food she had packed carefully from her own stores and not from Dorothy's. A coil of wire for snares and a small tin that had belonged to her mother and held nothing now but the memory of having held things. She did not look back at the house. She walked north through the homestead gate and along the track that connected it to the Millhaven Road, and she walked through the center of Millhaven because it was the most direct route to where she was going, and she wasn't going to walk a longer route simply to avoid being seen. Commissioner Aldous Prentice was standing outside the mercantile when she walked through. He was always standing somewhere that allowed him to observe the main street because observation was one of the primary tools of a man who believed that order required maintenance. He watched Sigrid walk past with his hands in his coat pockets and the expression of a man watching something predictable that nevertheless confirms a belief he already held. "That," he said, not quietly, not even attempting quiet. The comment clearly intended for the several men standing nearby, and for Sigrid herself if she chose to listen, "is what comes of raising a girl without sufficient discipline. A decent young woman would find a way to make herself useful to her stepmother. A decent young woman would not be walking the prairie like a vagrant with no one to answer to and no plan for her situation." Sigrid heard every word. She kept walking. She did not look at him. She did not slow down. She did not alter her pace or her direction or the set of her shoulders by any observable amount. She walked through Millhaven and out the other side and kept going north into the open grassland toward the 5 miles of flat plain that separated the town from the homestead of Einar Volstad. The wind came at her from the northwest the way it almost always came, steady and cold, and without malice, simply present the way the wind on the Nebraska plain is always present, not as a weather event, but as a condition of existence, something you factor into every plan, the way you factor in the distance between one point and another. She walked into it without complaint. Einar Volstad was 72 years old and had been living on the Nebraska plain longer than Millhaven had existed as anything more than a name on a surveyor's map. He was a Norwegian like Halvard, like Sigrid. Though the Norwegian he still sometimes spoke to himself in the early mornings was the old kind, the Norwegian of a man who left young and has kept the language alive in his head for 50 years. Through sheer stubbornness, worn smooth by decades of disuse, its edges rounded, its idioms drifted. He had come to Nebraska before it was Nebraska in any official sense, in the years when the land was simply land, vast and flat, and offering itself to anyone willing to stake a claim and do the work. His hands were ruined. The arthritis had been working on them for 20 years and had achieved by now the kind of thoroughness that left no room for optimism about recovery. The knuckles were swollen and misshapen, the fingers locked into angles that no longer quite matched what hands were meant to look like. On cold mornings, and in Nebraska in October every morning was a cold morning, he could not hold a cup without both palms wrapped around it for the warmth. But his eyes were sharp and clear and had lost nothing. And his mind held things that no amount of physical deterioration could touch, things he had learned over 50 years of paying attention to a landscape that most men underestimated because it looked simple, because it was flat, because it lacked the drama of mountains or the obvious richness of river valleys. Einar had learned early that the plain was not simple. It was the most complex thing he had ever tried to understand, and he was still learning it. He had known Halvard Enberg for 20 years. They had arrived in the same general season, each coming from different directions, and had found each other through the mutual recognition of men who share a language in a place where that language is rare. Their friendship had been built on the Nebraska model, practical, unsentimental, built around the exchange of useful information and the occasional shared labor that neither man could accomplish alone. He had known Sigrid since she was 6 years old and newly arrived from Norway, still carrying the ocean crossing in her body, still adjusting to the scale of the sky in this country, which was a different sky from the Norwegian sky, bigger, higher, more relentless in its openness. She had been a quiet child, too quiet for her age, with the particular watchfulness of a child who has learned that the world can change without warning, and that the best response to this is to pay very close attention to everything. She had not changed much in 11 years, he thought, when she appeared at his door that Friday afternoon. The watchfulness was still there, the quiet, the set of the jaw that said she had already thought through what she needed to do and had come here not for sympathy but for something specific. He looked at her for a long moment, the pack on her back, the oversized wool coat, the dry eyes, the calm. That was not indifference but control, which are different things and important to distinguish. And he stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. "I'll put the coffee on." She sat at his table and told him what had happened. She told it without embellishment, without the kind of narrative shaping that people sometimes apply to their own stories to make themselves appear more sympathetic or their situation more dramatic. She told it the way her father had taught her to speak the facts in order the relevant details included the irrelevant ones left out. Einar listened. He did not interrupt. He poured the coffee when it was ready and set the cups down and let her finish. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. He wrapped his ruined hands around his cup and looked at the steam rising from it and thought about what to say, which is what a man does when he has something important to say and wants to say it correctly. "Your father came to me 2 summers ago," he said finally. "Late June, I think. He rode over on a Tuesday, and he had something on his mind." Sigrid looked up. "He knew the prairie," Einar said, "better than most men who've lived here twice as long. He knew what it could take. He knew what could happen to a man working alone far from help, with no margin for error." He paused. "He was not afraid. I want to be clear about that. Halvard Enberg was not a man who was afraid of things. But he was a man who thought clearly about risk, and he had thought clearly about the risks of his situation, and one of them was that something could happen to him and leave you alone." "He never said anything to me," Sigrid said. "No, he wouldn't have. Not because he didn't trust you, but because telling you would have required explaining all the things he was worried about, and he wasn't the kind of man who shared his worries. He was the kind of man who addressed them." Einar took a careful sip of his coffee. "He asked me to teach him something. Something I had learned a long time ago from people who knew this land long before any of us thought to settle it." He told her about the dugout. Not a soddy, not the kind of sod house that settlers built in those years. The structures that sat on the surface of the ground and presented their walls to the wind and their roofs to the snow load and required wood or buffalo chips to heat and were, when you thought about it, clearly fundamentally compromises between what people wanted shelter to be and what was actually available to build it with in a country with almost no trees. A true dugout was a different thing entirely. Cut into the south face of a hill, specifically the south face for reasons that had to do with the angle of winter sun and the natural drainage of the hillside in the direction of the prevailing winds. Cut deep below the frost line, far enough down that the temperature of the surrounding earth was no longer affected by the temperature of the air above. At that depth, the earth maintained a steady warmth that had nothing to do with fire and everything to do with physics, the residual heat of summer stored in the ground, the way a stone holds the warmth of the sun after the sun is set. The Lakota had known this. They had built such structures in the years before the settlers arrived, structures that were part of the landscape rather than placed upon it, structures that could disappear under a blanket of snow and be completely invisible to anyone who did not know exactly where to look. Einar had lived among them for one winter 30 years before, when he had been young and lost and half frozen on the open plain after his horse died under him. They had taken him in, they had kept him alive, and they had shown him over the course of that long winter how the land worked, not how to take from it, not how to impose a structure on it, but how to read it, how to ask it for what you needed, how to work with its nature rather than against it. The earth stays 55 degrees at depth, they had told him. It does not matter what the air above is doing. The earth remembers summer and holds it until summer returns. "Your father and I," Einar said slowly, "spent 3 days on Harper's Ridge that summer. There is a south-facing slope there, part of the land he never filed on 30 acres on the eastern edge of his claim that he had always considered worthless because there was no water close and the grass was thin. We started a hole. We wanted to see if the principle held in Nebraska ground the way it held in the ground I had worked with the Lakota." He stopped. He turned the cup in his hands. "We got maybe 8 feet in before the weather shifted and we had to stop. He said he would go back in the spring. He left his tools there rather than carry them home, buried them in a canvas wrap under a flat stone near where we had started, in case he came back before I could ride out with him again. He looked at her steadily. He never told you any of this. No, Sigrid said. He didn't want to worry you. He thought of it as a precaution, the way he thought of keeping extra grain in the second barn. Something he hoped he would never need. Something he would tell you about when it was done, and there was something real to show you rather than a plan that might come to nothing. Einar was quiet for a moment. He said, and I am going to tell you exactly what he said, because I have been holding it for 2 years waiting for the right moment, and I think this is the right moment, he said. If anything happens to me before this is done, take Sigrid to that hillside and finish it. That hill and what's in it belong to her. It's all I can leave her that Dorta can't touch. The kitchen held a silence that had weight to it. Sigrid sat with it. She did not cry. She felt something move through her that was not grief, exactly grief she had already spent 3 days doing alone in her room, quietly in a way that no one saw and no one was meant to see. What she felt now was something different, something that might have been called recognition or completion or simply the feeling you get when you understand that a person you have lost was thinking about you, even when you did not know it. He knew, she said, not a question. He knew the prairie, Einar said. He prepared for what he could prepare for. That is what a man does for the people he loves. He does not leave them a speech about how much he cared. He leaves them something they can use. They went to Harper's Ridge the following week on the first day the weather was clear enough to work. The tools were where Halvard had left them, wrapped in canvas under the flat stone near the base of the south slope, exactly where Einar described. When Sigrid unwrapped the canvas, working the knots open with careful fingers, the cloth stiff with 2 summers of weather, she found her father's shovel, his pick, his measuring string, still coiled, and tied a hand-level 2 chisels of different sizes. She held the shovel for a long moment. It was a good shovel, the kind of tool a man buys once and takes care of because he intends it to last. The handle was worn smooth in the places where Halvard's hands had always rested, polished to a particular finish by years of grip. She recognized those worn places. She had watched her father's hands on this handle so many times that she knew the exact position he would have held it in. She did not speak. Then she set the blade against the south face of the hill at the angle Einar indicated and drove it in. The work began. Einar could not dig. His hands would not form the grip required, and even if they could, the force needed to break new ground would have destroyed what remained of the joints. But he was not there to dig. He was there to think and to direct and to remember, which are different kinds of work and no less essential for being invisible. He sat on the slope above her on a blanket he had brought because the ground was cold, and he was 72, and the cold went into old bones faster than it went into young ones. And he directed the excavation with the precision of a man who has done this before and remembers every mistake worth avoiding. The angle of entry was critical. Too steep, and water would pool in the floor during spring thaw. Too shallow, and you lost the depth that gave you the earth's insulation. The exact angle Einar specified, he measured it with his eye and with a stick, and with reference to the position of the midday sun, was the product of things he had learned from the Lakota and refined through his own experience. He had built 3 of these structures in his life. 2 of them had kept men alive through winters that had killed people in conventional buildings 30 yards away. The dimensions were specific, 12 feet wide to allow for the minimum space a person needed to live in without going slowly insane from confinement, 20 feet deep into the hill to get sufficient earth mass above and around to hold the temperature. Walls cut vertically, not angled, because angled walls reduce floor space, and also Einar explained because the vertical cut created a tension in the surrounding earth that actually stabilized the wall over time, the soil compressing against itself rather than slumping. The work was brutal in the way that all honest physical labor is brutal when it is done correctly, which is to say it demanded everything she had every day and left her with nothing in reserve. The ground in October was still workable, but it was not easy. It was dense with the roots of years of prairie grass matted together into a layer that had to be cut before the soil below could be moved. The roots grabbed the blade and held it. She learned to rock the shovel rather than pull it, to cut at angles that severed rather than pulled. She dug every day from first light to the point where the cold made the work genuinely dangerous, when her fingers went from cold to numb to something beyond numb that she recognized as the beginning of damage and could not afford. She hauled the excavated earth away in a canvas sheet, dragging it around the shoulder of the hill to a shallow depression on the north face where she spread it thin and scattered dead grass over it, so it looked like nothing more than the uneven ground that wind creates in open country. She cut cottonwood from the creek 3 miles east, carrying it back in loads. She sized carefully large enough to make the trips efficient, small enough that she could carry each load without dragging it because drag marks in October mud were visible, and visible things created questions. She notched the beams herself using the chisels in her father's kit, and a technique Einar described from memory, fitting them into the walls of the excavation at the depth he specified, and testing each one before moving to the next. The sod for the roof came from the north-facing slope of the hill, cut in blocks of exact dimensions. Again, Einar's specification for reasons of both strength and concealment. Sod cut in blocks rather than strips was easier to handle, and when laid with staggered joints, created a roof that was structurally much stronger than it looked. It also, when the grass was replaced on top and the seams settled with a winter's worth of freeze-thaw cycling, became completely indistinguishable from the natural hillside around it. 2 weeks into the excavation, Prentice came. Word had spread through Millhaven the way words always spread through small towns, without accuracy and with great enthusiasm, gaining detail and color with each telling, regardless of whether those details and colors bore any relationship to fact. The Edinburgh girl was out on the ridge, people said, digging herself a hole, living in the ground like an animal, some kind of madness. Clearly, what else would you expect after what she'd been through? Prentice rode out with 8 men on a Thursday morning, approaching from the east along the road from town, which meant he came at Harper's Ridge from exactly the wrong direction. He rode straight up the east face on a line that took him over the crest and down the south slope, which is where a logical man would begin searching, because the south slope was the slope that faced the road and was therefore the slope that a person in the ordinary course of events would build on. He found disturbed ground on the south slope. Some of it, not as much as he expected, because Sigrid had been careful, but enough to tell him that someone had been working there. He also found the faint smell of a fire that had been cold for several hours. She had heard them coming from far enough away that she had been able to bank the stove completely and let the smell disperse before they arrived. He found nothing else. He walked the hillside for 40 minutes. He was at as close as 30 feet from the entrance to the dugout the entire time. He walked in a grid, methodical and thorough, because he was a thorough man. He stood on Sigrid's roof twice without knowing it was there, once near the center, once near the eastern edge, each time looking down at ground that appeared completely undisturbed and moving on. Below him, Sigrid lay in the dark partial, because the stove was banked to coals, and she had not lit the candle, but a thin thread of light came through the chimney pipe from the overcast sky above and counted his footsteps. She did not move. She barely breathed. She listened to him walk the roof of her house and felt something that was not quite fear and not quite anything else, something closer to the clear, cold alertness of an animal that has gone completely still, because stillness is the correct response to the current situation. He left eventually. She heard him tell the men with him that whoever had been there had moved on, was probably in the next county by now, and that the disturbed earth was most likely badgers. She heard the note in his voice, the note of a man who has made a decision about what he believes and intends to stick to it. What he did not mention riding back to Millhaven was the smoke. Because he had looked back once from the flat ground south of the ridge, and there it was, thin gray rising from the empty hillside he had just walked for 40 minutes. He told himself it was gas from the ground. He had read about such phenomena. It was a known thing. It happened in certain geological conditions where organic material was decomposing beneath the surface and producing gases that escaped through natural vents. He told himself this with considerable firmness all the way back to Millhaven. Sigrid heard the horses leave. She counted to 600. Then she reached up and lit the candle. She went back to work. Through November, the construction continued. The stove arrived in pieces, carried out by Einar across 2 visits on a small cart. His aging horse could manage a good iron stove, compact, efficient, designed to burn small amounts of wood and produce a disproportionate amount of heat. The chimney pipe was the element that required the most thought. It needed to be narrow enough to be inconspicuous, to emerge from the hillside in a location that could be mistaken for a natural feature, and to draw well enough to pull smoke from the stove reliably even in low wind conditions. Einar had solved this problem years ago. The solution was to run the pipe at a shallow angle through the roof structure and bring it out between 2 rocks on the hillside that he selected specifically because they were already there, already natural, already part of the landscape. The pipe emerged from between them at a height of about 6 inches above the ground surface, painted the same gray-brown as the rocks around it, and with a small cap designed to break the smoke into a thin dispersed thread rather than a concentrated column. The smoke that resulted from this arrangement was barely visible at 100 yards. At a quarter mile, the minimum distance from which anyone from Millhaven would approach the ridge, it was a thread, a wisp, something you had to be looking for to see, and even then something you might dismiss as the trick of winter light on cold air. The door was hung from cottonwood posts Sigrid set in the east wall of the entrance passage, the short, horizontal tunnel that connected the concealed opening in the hillside to the main room. The entrance itself was around the natural fold in the hill's south face, a crease in the topography that Einar had identified on their first visit as the ideal location for concealment. The fold created a pocket of dead ground, a zone invisible from the approach directions a person on horseback would naturally use. From the east, the south, and the west, the entrance was completely hidden behind the fold. From the north, the hill itself blocked the view. You had to know exactly where to look. You had to come from the right angle at the right height in the right direction, and even then, you had to know what you were looking for. By mid-November, the hut was finished. Sigrid stood in the center of it on the day it was done and turned slowly in a full circle, looking at everything. The walls were smooth, packed earth, slightly damp, holding their temperature with a steadiness she had not quite believed in until she experienced it. The stove in the corner was producing a steady, even warmth that had nowhere to go. Nowhere to escape through the gaps that every wood frame building leaked warmth through, because the insulation was as thorough as physics allowed. Dried grass packed into every joint. 2 buffalo hides Einar had kept for 20 years, large and heavy, and still good, hung against the north wall, where they added another layer of insulation against the coldest direction. The shelf along the east wall held 3 dozen jars of preserves, beans, corn, turnip, beets, and beside them the smoked meat she had been producing all through October, rabbit and prairie chicken, and 1 deer she had taken at the creek with a patience that had surprised even her. The bed was built into the east wall, a frame of cottonwood filled with prairie grass and covered with a wool blanket. The table was a plank on 2 uprights, small and sufficient, 12 feet wide, 20 feet deep, warm, invisible. Einar came to inspect it on the day it was complete, walking slowly across the hillside with the careful step of a man whose joints require advance notice of uneven ground. He stepped through the hidden entrance, moved through the tunnel, and came into the main room. He stood in the center of it and looked at everything for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Your father would be proud." He said it quietly, the way a man says something he is completely certain of. Sigrid nodded once. She did not trust herself to say anything for a moment, and so she said nothing, which was the right choice. "Warmer than anything I built at your age," Einar said. He moved to one of the cottonwood beams and put his swollen hand against it and pressed, testing the set. It did not move. Tighter, better hidden. He traced the angle of the chimney connection with his eye, following it from the stovepipe to the point where it entered the roof structure. They will never find it, not if they search 100 times. "They came back last week," Sigrid said. "Prentice, he brought more men." "I know, I heard about it in town." He stood on the roof. Einar looked at her. Not with surprise, she could see that he had assumed something like this had happened, but with something more careful. And he left," Sigrid said. "He couldn't find the door. He couldn't find anything. He walked back and forth above my head for 40 minutes, and I lay in the dark and counted his footsteps, and he left." The old man was quiet for a moment. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, but was headed in that direction. "The Lakota called it going into the earth," he said, "when they built places like this. They didn't mean it only as a building technique. They meant it as a kind of alignment with the land. The earth receives you, it holds you, it keeps you at the right temperature, while the world above does whatever it is going to do." He moved to the entrance tunnel and stood at its far end, looking back at the room, the stove, the shelves, the bed, and all of it contained in its warm earthen space. "They will keep looking," he said. "Prentice is not a man who accepts not knowing things. It troubles him in a specific way, not as curiosity, but as a challenge to his authority. And Dorothy will ask him to keep looking, because Dorothy will not feel entirely settled until she knows you are gone or accounted for." He paused. "But this," he gestured at the room, at the walls, at the invisible entrance behind him, at all of it together. "This is not a hole in the ground, Sigrid. This is a home. It is better made and better protected than anything standing in Millhaven." He left before dark, the way he always did, because 5 miles on an old horse in winter darkness was not something to be casual about at 72. Sigrid closed the door behind him and hung the latch and sat on the edge of her bed and listened to the silence settle back around her. The deep, total silence of the underground, a silence without wind in it, without the creak of wood contracting in cold, without any of the sounds that a conventional structure makes when the temperature outside drops away from the temperature inside, and the materials of the building register that difference in their language of groans and pops and subtle movements. Outside, the temperature was dropping toward 20 below. Inside, the stove ticked quietly and the walls held their warmth, and the candle burned straight and perfectly still, because there was no draft anywhere in the room to disturb it. That night, lying on her back in the dark after the candle had burned down, Sigrid thought about her father. She thought about him the way you think about someone you cannot yet fully grieve, carefully with intention, selecting what to hold and what to set aside. She thought about the way he had walked the fence line every morning, checking each post with his hand east to west along the north boundary, the same sequence every single time, because consistency was how you caught the problem before it became a crisis. She thought about the way he had taught her to read the weather, the color of the western horizon at sundown, the quality of the light in the last half hour before dark, the behavior of the horses when the pressure changed, the smell that gets into the air before snow, in a way you can learn to recognize if you pay attention for enough seasons. She thought about the tools wrapped in canvas under the flat stone, about the 3 days he had spent on this hillside 2 summers ago, without telling her, about the fact that he had looked at his life and his situation and thought clearly about what could go wrong, and then quietly, without making a speech about it, had done something about it. He had not saved her. He had died before he could finish what he started. But he had saved her in the only way that actually mattered. He had given her the knowledge of where to go and what to do when she got there, passed through Einar as the instrument arriving exactly when it was needed. She pulled the blanket up and felt the warmth of the room close around her. In Millhaven, Prentice had apparently declared her dead at a council meeting. Einar had told her this with a careful flatness that she appreciated, not trying to make it sound more or less than it was, simply reporting the fact. Froze out on the open prairie, Prentice had said. The smoke is some kind of natural phenomenon, gas escaping from the ground. The girl is gone. She was not gone. She was 15 feet below Aldous Prentice's boots, and she was warm, and she was fed, and she was lying in a home that she had built with her own hands, from the knowledge her father had given her, and no one could touch any part of it. Above her, rising from the frozen grass into the Nebraska sky, thin and steady and utterly inexplicable to every person in Millhaven who had ever looked toward Harper's Ridge and noticed it, the smoke continued to rise. From nowhere. From a fire she had built herself. In the dark. Before anyone knew she would need it. January came to Nebraska the way it always did, without apology. The temperature dropped to 30 below and stayed there for 2 weeks without movement, as though the cold had decided to stop being weather and start being geography, a permanent feature of the landscape, rather than a condition passing through it. The sky turned the color of old pewter and held that color from the first gray of dawn to the early dark of the afternoon, flat and featureless and offering nothing to look at that gave any comfort. The wind came out of the northwest at a steady 20 miles an hour, which in ordinary cold is unpleasant, and in 30 below cold is something that has no comfortable name, something that moves past sensation into consequence, past discomfort into the territory where exposure becomes arithmetic. How long you can be out in it, how much skin you have covered, how fast the cold is working on the parts you haven't covered well enough. In Millhaven, people stayed inside. They burned wood. They burned coal when they had it, and when they didn't have coal, they burned what they had, and they told themselves that this was simply January, that January always felt like this, that February would be easier. On Harper's Ridge, 15 feet below the surface of the frozen ground, Sigrid Enberg was warm. Not the warmth of a room fighting the cold with fire, the anxious warmth that comes from burning things fast enough to stay ahead of what the cold is taking. The steady, sourceless warmth of the earth itself, 55 degrees in every direction, rising from the floor, radiating from the walls, present in the air without effort, without fuel, without the constant calculation of how much wood you had left and how long you needed it to last. The stove added to it brought the room up to something closer to 60 on most evenings, but the stove was almost secondary. She burned a fraction of what Millhaven burned, a fraction of a fraction, and every morning the thin thread of smoke rose from between the rocks on the hillside above her and drifted up into the pewter sky and continued to be exactly what it had been for 2 months, inexplicable, undeniable, and completely impossible to locate. Because what men cannot explain, they eventually stopped looking at. And Prentice, after 4 failed search parties, had apparently decided that the smoke was what he had always said. It was a natural phenomenon, gas from the ground, something geological and boring, and beneath the attention of a man with a town to run. Her days had a shape to them. She had imposed that shape deliberately in the second week of November, when she recognized that the absence of structure was more dangerous than the cold, that a person living alone in a small space without routine was a person beginning a slow slide towards something that had no good end. She had seen it in the faces of men who came back from long winters on isolated claims, the particular blank quality that came from too many days with nothing required of you and nothing to organize the hours. She rose before dawn, not because dawn demanded it, but because the early hours were the clearest, the hours when the mind was sharpest and the world made the most straightforward kind of sense before the weight of the day accumulated. She lit the stove from the banked coals. She ate dried corn and smoked meat most mornings occasionally, something from the preserves, occasionally an egg, if one of the two prairie hens she kept in a small wooden box near the stove had decided to cooperate with the season. After breakfast, she worked. The root cellar was the current project. She was extending it, digging an additional 6 feet deeper below the main room floor, shoring the new depth with cottonwood planks she had cut and cured through the fall, creating a space that would hold produce at a temperature that would not freeze even in the coldest weeks. The work was slow in the confined space. She could only excavate a small volume at a time and had to haul the dirt up in a canvas bucket, one load after another, adding it to the mound she was building on the north slope under the cover of dead grass. But it was work, and work kept the blood moving and the mind engaged, and a moving mind in a small space is the difference between managing and deteriorating. In the afternoon, she went outside. This required discipline of a different kind, not the discipline of labor, but the discipline of method. She left through the hidden entrance at the fold in the hill, replacing the concealing brush exactly as she had found it, every piece in the same position, because a displaced branch in fresh snow was readable to anyone paying attention. She wore the coat the color of dead grass. She moved low and slow across the open hillside, keeping to the lines of the terrain that would break her silhouette to anyone watching from Millhaven. She ran her snare lines along the creek bottom, reset the ones that had fired, cleared the ones that had caught. She cut wood from the cottonwood stand 3 miles east and carried it back in load size for efficiency without drag. She checked the cache of supplies she kept near the entrance, making sure nothing had been disturbed, that the snowdrift that covered part of the cache looked natural and had not been interfered with. And she watched the animals. She had begun to notice in January something that she did not have a framework for, yet a change in the behavior of the wildlife around Harper's Ridge that was not dramatic, not something you would remark on if you were not paying close attention, but different from what she had observed through October and November in a way that she could feel even when she could not articulate it. The rabbits were running different patterns, not dramatically different. She was still catching them at the same locations, still finding their tracks in the expected places along the creek bank. But the direction of the patterns had shifted. They were moving differently in relation to the wind taking shelter earlier in the afternoon than they had in the fall, moving in a way that suggested a kind of urgency that had not been there before. The hawks that usually worked the ridge in the afternoons, two of them a pair, she had been watching since October, were absent, not just on cold days, on all days. She had not seen either of them for 2 weeks. The cattle on the Hofstetter farm 2 miles south were clustering near the creek bank in the low ground rather than grazing the open field the way they normally would even in cold weather. Cattle in winter grazed because they needed to. These cattle were standing heads together, avoiding the open ground as though the open ground had become something to avoid. She noted these things. She stored them carefully the way you store observations that don't yet mean anything but might mean something later. She said nothing to anyone because there was no one to say anything to. Einar came twice a week when the weather allowed. He arrived in the late morning, usually when the temperature had risen as far as it was going to rise, and the light was at its best, and the 5 miles from his homestead could be covered with the smallest risk. He brought small things. She could not make herself a new candle mold in December, a paper of salt, a spool of thread, once a small jar of molasses that he set on her shelf without comment, and that she rationed with a care that made it last 3 weeks. He sat in the chair by the stove and drank coffee and talked when he had something to say and was quiet when he didn't. He had learned silence the way very few people learn it, as a form of presence rather than an absence of engagement. When Einar was quiet with you, you did not feel ignored or abandoned. You felt accompanied. It was one of the things Sigrid valued most about his company, in a winter when company was rare. He told her about the years he had lived among the Lakota. Not all at once, the story came in pieces, distributed across many visits, like a thing he was letting her see from different angles rather than presenting as a finished whole. He had been 22 when his horse died on the open plain, and they found him. He had expected, he said, that they would move on and leave him, because why would they not? He was a stranger, a white man unable to speak a word of their language, in a condition that made him a burden rather than a help. They had not left him. They had taken him in the way you'd taken someone who needs taking in without making an event of it, without requiring that he become something other than what he was. They had fed him and warmed him, and over the weeks that followed begun to show him things. Not as lessons. He did not use that word because lessons implied a teacher-student relationship that was not quite what it had been. More as demonstrations, as the natural sharing of knowledge that happens when you live closely with people who know something you don't. He had learned to read the land the way they read it, as a continuous text available to anyone who had learned the grammar. The behavior of animals was part of that grammar. Weather was part of it. The color and smell of the air, the patterns of the clouds, the way the frost formed on certain mornings, the direction and quality of the wind, all of it was language. All of it was saying something if you had learned to listen. Prentice, Einar said one afternoon in the second week of January, his eyes on the stove, his tone, the same unhurried tone he used for everything, called another council meeting last week. Sigrid looked up from the moccasins she was restitching with a bone needle and sinew thread. He told the town that you were dead, that the smoke they had all been seeing was going escaping from the ground. A geological phenomenon, he said, though he didn't use the word geological, he said natural. As in nothing to worry about, nothing to look for, nothing that has anything to do with a 17-year-old girl who should have had the decency to die somewhere visible. He paused. He said it with great certainty. He doesn't know what he doesn't know, Sigrid said. No. Einar was quiet for a moment. That is precisely the problem with that man, not the things he knows and is wrong about. Those can be corrected when the evidence is sufficient. The problem is the things he doesn't know and has decided he doesn't need to know. Then Einar stopped coming. It was the third week of January. She noticed after 2 days, not with alarm, not yet, because 2 days was within the range of normal variation. A day of bad weather, a problem at his homestead, any of a dozen reasonable things. She continued her routine. She went out in the afternoons. She worked on the root cellar in the mornings. She noted his absence the way you note a silence, where there is usually sound, as something present in its own right, something with its own weight. 4 days, then a week. The temperature outside had dropped to 35 below, and the wind had returned with it, and she could not travel 5 miles to his homestead in those conditions, not safely, not in the time between first light and early dark. That was all she had. She could get there. She was not sure she could get back. She stoked the stove and worked the root cellar and ran her snare lines in the mornings, when the cold moderated slightly, and she went to bed each night not knowing if he was alive. On the 8th day, she knew it was the 8th because she had been marking the days on the wall above her bed with a piece of charcoal, a practice she had started in November to keep time from becoming formless. She went out to check the snare line along the North Creek bank and found something that stopped her. Footprints. Human footprints in the snow in the approach to the fold in the hillside. She stopped 6 feet from the nearest print and looked at them without moving. They came from the north, not from Millhaven, not from the road from the north, from the direction of Einar's homestead. They approached the fold in the hillside at a line that showed the person had known where they were going, not searching, not wandering, but walking directly to the place. They stopped 6 feet from the entrance. In the prints, you could see where the person had stood for a longer time. The snow compressed more deeply, the edges of the print more disturbed where weight had shifted. Someone had stood here for a while, looking. Then the prints turned and went back the way they came. Nothing had been touched. Nothing had been moved. No attempt had been made to open the door or find the entrance. She stood there in the cold and looked at the prints and thought carefully. They were old, at least a day, maybe 2. The edges rounded by the small amount of temperature cycling that happened even in 35 below weather. Whoever had made them had come and gone without her knowing. She increased the brush concealment at the entrance. She rearranged the rocks near the chimney pipe to make them look more natural from the north approach. She thought about it for 2 days, sleeping lightly, waking at small sounds, and arrived at no conclusion that satisfied her. On the 10th day, she made a decision. She packed a small bag, dried meat fire striker, her wool blanket, and she started toward town. Not north toward Einar's homestead, which was where she needed to go but could not safely reach. South toward Millhaven, because if something had happened to Einar, someone in Millhaven would know, and she needed to know more than she needed to stay hidden. She walked 2 miles before she stopped. She stopped on the crest of a low rise, not Harper's Ridge itself, but a smaller swell of ground to the south of it, and she stood and looked down at Millhaven spread out in the flat winter light below her. She could see the mercantile, the steeple of the church white against the gray sky, the line of buildings along the main street, each of them trailing thick columns of smoke from their chimneys. Heavy smoke, the smoke of buildings burning everything they had to stay warm. Nothing like the thin thread that rose behind her from the hillside. She stood there for a long time. She thought about what walking down that hill would mean. Not the practical danger of it, what Prentice might do, how Dorothy would respond, the legal and material complications. She thought about what it would cost her in a currency that had nothing to do with law or money. She had walked out of that town without asking for anything. She had built something in the dark that they said was impossible. She had lived through 2.5 months of a Nebraska winter alone without help, without charity, without asking for or receiving a single thing from the people who had watched her walk away. If she walked back in now, she would be the girl who couldn't manage on her own. That was not what Halvard Enberg had raised. It was not what those 3 days on Harper's Ridge, those tools wrapped in canvas under the flat stone, had been meant to produce. She stood on that hill for 20 minutes. The cold worked at the exposed skin of her face and the backs of her hands. Below her, Millhaven went about the business of surviving January with no awareness that she was there. Then she turned around and walked back to Harper's Ridge. She rationed what she had. She managed. She was fine. Einar returned on the 12th day. She heard the horse first, the particular sound of an old horse moving carefully on hard ground, and she opened the door before he reached the entrance because she had been listening for exactly that sound for 12 days, and her hearing had become, over the weeks of living underground, extraordinarily sensitive to the sounds that came through the earth and the entrance tunnel. He looked wrong, not dramatically wrong. Einar was not a man whose face showed distress easily because he had spent too many years in situations that required him to keep his face neutral, but his color was off the grayish undertone beneath his weathered skin that appears when old lungs have been fighting something and haven't won cleanly. He moved with a stiffness beyond his usual arthritic stiffness. He sat down in the chair by the stove and put his hands around the coffee cup she set in front of him without being asked, and he drank without speaking, which told her more than anything he could have said about how the 12 days had been. "I'm all right," he said eventually. "I know," she said. She did not say, "I was not sure you would come back." She did not say, "I almost went to town." There was no useful purpose served by saying either of those things. He was here. He was alive. The 12 days had ended. She made broth from smoked bones, and he drank it in the chair, and they did not talk much that evening, and she let him sleep in the chair. When he drifted off, which he did about an hour after he arrived, his chin dropping to his chest, his breathing becoming the slow, slightly ragged breathing of old lungs that had been working hard. She sat at the table and worked on the moccasin, and listened to him breathe and felt something that she did not immediately name. Something that had to do with the 12 days and the footprints in the snow and the 2 miles she had walked toward town and the 20 minutes she had stood on the hill looking down at Millhaven and then turned around. Something that had to do with what it meant to have one person, one out of all the people in the world, who knew where you were and came anyway. When he woke in the early morning still in the chair, she had broth hot on the stove and more coffee ready. He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked at the entrance tunnel, at the fresh rearrangement of the concealment brush visible through the passage, and his eyes came back to her face. "You found the tracks," he said. She looked at him. "I came on the 8th day," he said. "I couldn't stay away. I needed to know you were still here." He paused. "My legs wouldn't carry me all the way in. I had to stop at the entrance. I stood there for a while, and then I went back." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "I'm sorry if it frightened you." She was quiet for a moment, thinking about the prince, the careful approach from the north, the long pause, the turning away. "It didn't frighten me," she said, which was not entirely true, but was not entirely false either. "I just didn't know what they meant." "Now you know," he said. She nodded. She set his broth in front of him. They sat together in the warmth of the underground room while the January wind moved across the surface of the earth above them, and neither of them said anything more about it because nothing more needed to be said. He recovered over the following weeks slowly and without fanfare, the way old men recover from things, not dramatically, not with visible milestones, but through a gradual accumulation of better days that eventually outnumbered the worse ones. He talked more as he recovered. He sat in the chair longer before sleeping. He started commenting on the construction of the root cellar extension, suggestions, adjustments, the same kind of knowledgeable direction he had given during the original excavation. It was on the 4th day of his recovery, in the long quiet afternoon, when the light through the chimney pipe was at its best angle, and the stove was holding the room at 60 degrees, and the world outside had settled into the particular stillness that 30 below weather sometimes achieves, that Sigrid began to understand something she had not fully understood before. She was preparing for herself. She had known this from the beginning. The food she had stored, the wood, she had cut the root cellar, she was extending. All of it was sized for her needs, organized around her requirements, calibrated to what she needed to survive the winter. But she was producing more than she needed. The root cellar could hold 3 times what one person required for one winter. The snare lines were producing more than she could eat, and she had been smoking the surplus without a clear reason, just the instinct that surplus was not something to waste. The hut was 12 feet wide and 20 feet deep. She was one person 5'3", using perhaps a third of the floor space. She had been thinking about survival in the narrowest possible terms. Einar told her about the winter of 1856 on the 4th day of his recovery. He told it the way he told all his stories, without drama, without decoration, letting the facts carry the weight they already had, without adding to it artificially. He had been 22 with a survey party working through what would become Nebraska territory. 40 men well-equipped by the standards of the time with tents and food, and the confidence that comes from having survived previous winters in this country. The storm came in February, not the kind of blizzard that appears in the ordinary record of hard winters, the kind that lasts 2 days and kills livestock, and closes roads and then ends, leaving the world changed but recoverable. This was something different. The temperature dropped 50 degrees in less than 4 hours. The wind came at 70 miles an hour across ground with nothing to stop it. The snow came sideways, not falling but driving, and within 30 minutes of its beginning, you could not see the man standing next to you. They had tried everything the conventional approach offered. Tents reinforced with sod walls, a quickly constructed wind barrier of logs and brush. Everything failed. The wind found every gap. The cold moved through everything they built, as though the structures were suggestions rather than shelter. 39 men died. Einar survived because he had dug not a proper dugout, not anything like what he and Sigrid had built on Harper's Ridge, just a hole in the south bank of a frozen creek. Deep enough to get below the wind, covered with what he could find. Barely enough. But barely enough is the difference between surviving and not surviving, and it is a difference that matters enormously to the person on the surviving side of it. He was quiet after he finished. Sigrid looked at the walls of her hut, at the shelves, the stove, the root cellar entrance, and the floor, at the 12 feet of width, at the 20 feet of depth, at the food stores that were more than she needed, the wood that was more than she could burn, the space that was more than she occupied. How long did it last? She asked. The storm in 1856. 6 days, Einar said. She nodded. She looked at the root cellar. And what did the animals do before it came? What were they doing in the days before the storm arrived? He looked at her for a long moment. His expression shifted, not surprise exactly, but the look of a man who has seen something he was hoping to see and is taking a moment to recognize it. The cattle clustered low, he said, away from high ground, into the creek bottoms and the draws. The hawks disappeared a full 3 weeks before it arrived. The rabbits ran different patterns. He paused. Why do you ask? She told him what she had been watching. The cattle on the Hofstetter farm standing in the low ground by the creek. The 2 hawks she had been observing on the ridge gone for more than 2 weeks. The rabbits with their shifted patterns and their earlier sheltering. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. The stove ticked. The earth held its temperature around them. Outside, the wind moved across the frozen surface of the Nebraska plain at a steady 20 miles an hour, finding nothing to stop it between where it had started and Harper's Ridge. There is going to be a storm, Einar said. Not as a prediction that might or might not prove correct, as a fact he was informing her of. Not this week, not next week perhaps, but before winter is done, the kind I saw in 1856. He looked at her steadily. Maybe worse. Sigrid looked around the room, at the walls, the shelves, the dimensions. She thought about the surplus she had been producing without knowing why. She thought about the root cellar she was building larger than she needed. She thought about the hut 12 feet wide, 20 feet deep, warm and visible, holding its temperature with no dependence on the wood supply above. How many people are in Millhaven? She asked. 30 families, Einar said. Perhaps 130, 140 people, counting the new settlement on the south section. She did not say what she was thinking. It was too early. The storm might not come. Einar might be wrong. She might be wrong. The animals might be responding to something she had misread entirely. But that evening after Einar had gone home, she began adjusting her preparations. She was no longer preparing only for herself. February arrived and the weather did something that she had not expected, but that Einar, when she described it, recognized immediately. It went wrong in the wrong direction. Warm days, days that had no business being warm in Nebraska in February days, where the temperature climbed above freezing and the snow softened at the edges, and you might have been forgiven for thinking the winter was breaking early. These were followed by hard freezes that came without transition, the temperature dropping 30 degrees overnight with no gradual movement, no step between warm and cold, just a shift as sudden as a door closing. The wind changed direction 3 times in a single afternoon on the 8th of February. She tracked it northwest in the morning, south by midday, back to northwest by evening. Wind that cannot decide its direction is wind that is being organized by something larger than the local pattern. The sky went wrong too. It shifted from clear to a yellow-gray overcast and back to clear in the space of an hour, the kind of sky that looks like weather thinking about itself, weather that has not yet committed to a direction but is building toward one. Sigrid watched all of it from the entrance to her hut and from the observation point on the ridge crest that she had been using through the winter to check the surrounding landscape without being seen. She watched and she adjusted. She cut more wood than she believed she could possibly burn in a single winter. She organized the food cache near the entrance so she could move large quantities inside quickly if she needed to, if the situation arose where she needed to take on a quantity of stores very fast. She checked the chimney pipe and cleared the rocks around it and calculated the maximum snow depth it could handle before the draw would be affected and whether she needed to extend the pipe to account for a larger drift than the one that had accumulated in January. She reinforced the door frame with additional cottonwood bracing, setting the new pieces at angles that would distribute a snow load laterally rather than allowing it to concentrate on the hinges. She expanded the hut's floor space as much as the existing structure allowed, not digging new rooms, which would have taken time she might not have, but rearranging what she had. The bed moved to the north wall. The table moved against the east wall. The woodpile, when she increased it to its new level, occupied a portion of the space she freed up. She calculated floor space against the number of people who might use it and what they would need and what she could provide. Einar watched her work during his visits and said little. He brought what he could manage on the cart, an additional wool blanket, 2 more candles, and a paper of dried herbs that she recognized when she unfolded it. Yarrow, willow bark, the plants her father had kept in a cloth bag on the top shelf of the pantry at the homestead, brought out when someone had a fever, when someone needed something the body couldn't provide for itself. For fever, Einar said, setting the paper on her shelf without elaboration. Keep them dry and sealed. She put them in a tin and pressed the lid tight and set it on the highest shelf above everything else where nothing could get to it. She did not ask who the fever was for. In Millhaven, Commissioner Aldous Prentice called a meeting in the second week of February. He stood at the front of the meeting hall, which was the largest interior space in Millhaven, used for town councils and church services and the occasional dance, a single large room with a wood stove at each end that together managed to keep the temperature bearable in ordinary winter weather, and he addressed the assembled citizens on the subject of the coming spring, because that was how he framed it, the coming spring. Not the remaining winter. Spring was the subject, and it was approaching, and whatever difficulty remained between this February and that spring was the ordinary difficulty of a Nebraska winter in a town full of people who had survived Nebraska winters before and would survive this one. He was a good speaker, controlled, authoritative, the kind of man whose physical presence alone conveys a credibility that the words then reinforce. He had built things in this town. Real things, the mercantile, the road improvements, the drainage system along the main street that had stopped the spring flooding that had plagued the town's first 3 years. He had earned his position through work, and the people of Millhaven knew it, and they were disposed to trust the judgment of a man who had earned their trust through demonstrated competence. Gulliver raised his hand from the back of the room. He was a farmer, a quiet man not given to speaking at public meetings, which was why people noticed when he raised his hand. He had farmed the south section for 20 winters and had the weathered, careful quality of a man who has spent that long paying attention to a landscape that punishes inattention directly and immediately. He said that the cattle were doing something strange, that they had been refusing to go to the open field for 10 days, clustering in the low ground near the creek with their heads together the way cattle behave when they are uneasy about something they can smell or sense that the people around them cannot. He said the horses were refusing to leave the barn on mornings when the sky looked perfectly clear. He said the hawks were gone and had been gone for 3 weeks. Prentice listened to this with the patient expression of a man enduring something that he has already decided not to take seriously, but is willing to hear through because dismissing it without hearing it would appear unreasonable. With respect, he said, when Gulliver had finished, livestock behavior, while sometimes indicative of immediate local conditions, an approaching predator, a change in water quality, that sort of thing, is not a reliable method for predicting weather patterns over periods of days or weeks. We are not farmers in ancient times who had no other tools. We have the weather reports from the Lincoln paper. We have the experience of 20 Nebraska winters among us collectively. He looked out at the assembled room with the expression of a man who is about to close an argument. Our buildings are solid. Our supplies are adequate. I have every confidence that we will see March without significant difficulty. The meeting ended. People went home. Prentice stayed in the hall for a while after the others left, banking one of the stoves and checking the window latches, doing the small maintenance of the space the way he always did when he was the last to leave, because it was his building to care for, and he cared for his buildings. He walked home through the empty main street in the February dark. The air was still unusually still for February, with none of the wind that normally moved through Millhaven at this hour. The sky was clear and full of stars, the particular hard clear of a sky with no moisture in it. He let himself into his office and sat at his desk without lighting the lamp. The window in front of him faced north, toward the open grassland, and at the far edge of the darkness, the low shape of Harper's Ridge against the slightly lighter sky. He had not sent another search party since November. Not because he had stopped believing the girl was out there. He had not stopped believing it, not entirely, and in his private moments, he had not stopped believing it at all. But 4 failed search parties were beginning to create a record that made him look incompetent, and Aldous Prentice did not look incompetent. He had made a decision. The girl was dead, the smoke was geological, the record was closed. That was the public position, and he intended to hold it. But he was alone in his office in the dark, and there was no public in a private office in the dark, and in the dark he could look north toward Harper's Ridge and see what he always saw: the smoke. Thin as a thread, barely visible even against the dark sky, but there steady and patient, impermanent. Rising from the empty hillside with the same unhurried consistency it had shown every night he had looked in that direction. He sat with it. He thought about what it meant, what it had always meant, what he had always known it meant, even while he was saying it was geological. He thought about what it would cost him to act on what he knew, what it would cost him publicly, what it would cost him in terms of the record he had made, what it would cost him to stand up and say to the people of Millhaven, "I was wrong about the smoke. I was wrong about the girl. I was wrong about several things I told you with great certainty." He sat with all of that for a long time. Then he stood up, put on his coat, and walked home through the dark and the still February air. He told himself for what would turn out to be the last time that it was gas from the ground. Sigrid did not sleep well in February. Not from cold, the hut maintained its temperature without difficulty, the stove on minimum fuel keeping the room above 60 on the coldest nights. Not from hunger, she was well provisioned, eating carefully but adequately from stores that she had planned well. She slept badly because something in the quality of the world above her had changed, and her body registered this change in the way a body registers things that the conscious mind is still processing, as restlessness, as broken sleep, as a pattern of waking in the complete dark of the hut and lying still and listening. The earth around her was quiet in the way it was always quiet, the deep layered quiet of underground with no wind and no weather, just the steady presence of the earth itself. But above that quiet, she could sometimes feel, rather than hear, something building. Not a sound exactly, a quality. The particular held breath quality of the atmosphere before it commits to something large. She increased the interior wood supply until there was barely room to navigate around the stack. She moved the most critical food stores, the densest calories, the highest value preserves, from the cache outside to the shelves inside, where they could not be buried by a snowdrift that changed the character of the entrance. She filled every container she owned with water and set them close enough to the stove that they would not freeze even if she let the fire drop. She could not know exactly when, but she knew it was coming. On the last day of February, Einar came in the late afternoon and sat for an hour quiet, drinking his coffee, looking at what she had done to the room, the stacked wood, the reorganized stores, the reinforced door frame, the water containers, all of it. He looked at it for a long time. Before he left, he stood in the entrance tunnel for a moment and looked back at the room with the expression of a man making a final assessment of something he has invested in significantly. "Whatever comes," he said, "this place will hold." "I know," Sigrid said. He looked at her in the long, steady look of a man who is trying to fix something exactly as it is at this moment in his memory. "Your father built well," he said. "Better than he knew. You built better than he could have hoped." Then he stepped out through the entrance and was gone, and she listened to the sound of the old horse picking its way carefully down the frozen hillside until the sound was too far away to hear. The morning of March 2nd came in soft and clear and entirely deceptive. The sky was the pale, hard blue of a sky that has wrung itself dry of moisture, or so it appeared. The kind of blue that belongs to April, not March. The temperature was above freezing for the first time in 6 weeks. The snow from the last storm had developed a thin ice crust that caught the early light and threw it back in small, sharp sparks. Sigrid stood in the entrance to her hut and breathed the morning air. It smelled wrong, not obviously wrong, clean and cold and almost warm the way the air smells on a good morning in a good season. But underneath that surface quality at the very edge of it, there was something else, something dry and electric, the trace of something distant. The smell of a large disturbance in the atmosphere that was too far away to hear or see, but close enough to smell if you knew what you were smelling for. She had smelled it once before. She had been 8 years old, standing in the yard of her father's homestead, and the sky had been this exact color, and the air had had this exact quality, and Halvard had come out of the barn and stopped and looked at the sky for a moment without expression, and then said very quietly without alarm, "Come inside now." He had been right. That had been the worst storm of 1876, the storm that had killed 2 families on the east section. She went back inside. She closed the door. She latched it with both latches. She added wood to the stove, not a little, a full load, and sat down on the edge of her bed and looked at the walls of the room her father had planned and her hands had built, and Einar's knowledge had made possible. 12 feet wide, 20 feet deep, 55 degrees in every direction, rising from the earth itself regardless of what the air above was doing. Whatever was coming, this place would hold. She was certain of it. Outside, the blue sky held for 3 more hours. In Millhaven, people opened windows. A woman hung laundry. The blacksmith worked with his doors open for the first time since October. And then the temperature began to drop. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours. There was no gradual transition, no shift in the sky that gave you time to read it and respond. 1 hour it was above freezing, the snow softening at its edges, the world suggesting a reprieve. The next hour, the thermometer outside the Millhaven Mercantile read 0 and was still moving. The hour after that, it had passed 0 and kept going, passing through numbers that belonged to January at its worst, and continuing past those heading toward territory that the thermometer's maker had presumably included on the scale as a theoretical consideration, not a practical one. The wind came from the northwest at 60 miles an hour. When wind moves at 60 miles an hour across flat Nebraska grassland, with nothing between it and where it is going, it does not feel like weather. It feels like physics, like a law of the universe being applied without negotiation. It does not distinguish between the solid and the insubstantial, between the planned and the unplanned, between the buildings of a man who has built it carefully and the buildings of a man who has built less carefully. At 60 miles an hour, wind finds every gap, every joint, every place where two surfaces meet with less than perfect contact, and it enters those places and does what cold air does when it enters a warm space. The snow came horizontal, not falling, moving, driving across the ground in dense continuous sheets that eliminated distance as a concept. Within an hour of the storm's beginning, the distance between one building and the next in Millhaven, distances measured in yards, distances a person crossed 100 times a day without thinking about it, became distances that could not be crossed safely. The air and the ground merged into one undifferentiated white. The sky disappeared. The world contracted to whatever enclosed space you happened to be standing in when the storm arrived, and it stayed contracted. Commissioner Aldous Prentice stood at the window of his office and watched Millhaven disappear. He watched the Mercantile go first, not destroyed, not fallen, just erased. One moment it was there, a solid presence he had helped build 40 feet across the street. The next moment it was gone, swallowed by white, as completely absent from the visible world as though it had never existed. Then the church steeple. Then the building directly across from him, a building he could have thrown a stone at with ease, vanishing into the driven snow as cleanly as a ship going underwater. He stood at the window for a long time. He was thinking about the smoke on Harper's Ridge. He had been thinking about it with increasing intensity for 3 days, since the morning when the weather had shifted in the wrong direction, since the afternoon when the sky had gone yellow-gray, and then clear, and then wrong again, since the moment he had stood in his office in the dark on the last night of February and told himself for the last time that it was gas from the ground. He was not telling himself that anymore. 15 feet below the surface of Harper's Ridge, Sigrid heard the storm arrive. Not as sound the earth absorbed sound, the way it absorbed cold, reducing the howl of 60-mile-an-hour wind to a distant, muffled pressure against the top of the world, theoretical rather than immediate. She heard it as a shift in the quality of the silence around her, a change in the pressure of the air in the hut, that she felt in her ears, small but real. She added wood to the stove. Not a small addition, a full load carefully placed for efficiency, the pieces oriented for maximum contact, the damper adjusted for the burn rate she wanted. She checked her water containers. All full, all positioned correctly, all above freezing. She lit 2 candles and set them on the shelf in positions where they would not be knocked over, and looked at the room around her. The stacked wood occupied the north wall from floor to ceiling, more than she had expected to need for herself alone, enough for a different purpose. The food stores were organized on the shelves and in the root cellar below. Beans, corn, preserved vegetables, smoked meat, dried rabbit, prairie chicken, 2 dozen eggs preserved in lard. The extra blankets were folded at the foot of the bed. The yarrow and willow bark were in their sealed tin on the highest shelf. Everything was where it needed to be. She sat down at her table and did something she had not done since October. She simply sat. No work in her hands, no task in progress. She sat and listened to the distant sound of the storm working on the surface of the earth above her, and felt the quality of the warmth around her, and allowed herself for a few minutes to simply exist in what she had built. The temperature in the hut was 55 degrees. The stove would bring it to 60 before long. Outside, within 6 hours of the storm's beginning, the temperature reached 47 below zero. The first day was the worst for Millhaven, and then each subsequent day found new ways to be worse than the one before. The buildings held through the first day, Most of them, the wood-frame structures. The brick-faced mercantile, the solidly constructed meeting hall held through the first day because they had been built by men who understood Nebraska winters and had taken them seriously. But understanding ordinary Nebraska winters and being prepared for this storm were different categories of readiness, and the gap between them revealed itself with a methodical cruelty that had no interest in the effort that had gone into the construction of what it was destroying. Fuel was the first problem. The arithmetic of it was simple and devastating. Most families in Millhaven had provision for a week of hard weather because a week had always been enough. But the storm did not behave like weather that intended to last a week. It behaved like weather that had made different arrangements, and by the end of the second day, the fuel calculations that had been made on the first day, the confident calculations of people who had done this before, no longer held. On the third day, 3 homes on the north side of town lost their roofs. The snow load on the rooftops exceeded what the structures were designed to carry, and then the wind shifted slightly and added a lateral component to the vertical load, and the roofs went in the way that structures fail when they fail honestly quickly, without much warning, with a sound that is nothing like what you expect and exactly like what it is. The families in those houses had minutes, not hours, to get out. They moved into the building still standing. Strangers shared floors. The mercantile held 11 people who had nowhere else to go. Prentice opened the meeting hall and burned furniture to keep the temperature above the threshold where fingers and toes begin to die. By the 5th day, 17 people were dead. Not in a single event. One at a time, in the incremental way that a protracted hard winter takes people. An old man who had been weakened by illness before the storm arrived and did not have the reserve to hold against it. A child whose family's building lost its heat in the night before anyone understood that the heat was gone. A farmer from the south section who had tried to cross the 40 feet between his house and his woodpile and been found the next morning 60 feet from his front door, frozen into the posture of a man who knew exactly what was happening to him and had kept moving until he couldn't. 17 people, in a town of 30 families, by the 5th day. Prentice saw the smoke on the morning of the 5th day. The wind had dropped briefly, not stopped, not even significantly reduced, but moved from 60 miles an hour to something closer to 30, which was enough to allow shapes to exist in the distance again. He was outside the meeting hall, assessing the structural integrity of the north wall, when he looked toward Harper's Ridge and saw it, thin, gray, rising from the hillside with the same steady patience it had shown every day of that winter, through every temperature drop, through every wind, through every search party, and every declaration and every decision Prentice had made about what it was and what it meant. It rose from the hillside as though the storm were not happening at all, as though the world above the earth were a temporary inconvenience that had nothing to do with whoever was keeping that fire burning 15 feet below the surface. He stood in the wind and the cold and looked at it for a long time. He thought about all of it. The 8 search parties, the times he had walked that hillside, the times he had stood directly above the entrance he could not find, the council meeting where he had declared the girl dead, the council meeting in February where he had dismissed Gulliver's hand and Gulliver's cattle and Gulliver's careful 20-winter observation of the land he farmed. He thought about the night in his office when he had sat in the dark and looked north and told himself for the last time that the smoke was gas from the ground. He thought about 17 people. He went back inside the meeting hall and looked at the people in it, the survivors of the first 5 days, some of them in reasonable condition, many of them, not all of them, with the specific expression of people who have been managing a deteriorating situation for long enough that management has become an act of will rather than an act of planning. He needed to go to Harper's Ridge. He needed to go alone first. He needed to see it for himself, to find it, to see if he could find it, to know with certainty what was there before he brought others and was wrong, and there was nothing. And 17 people became more than 17. He told no one where he was going. He put on everything he had, coat, scarf, the extra wrappings he had salvaged from a collapsed building on the second day, and he went out into the wind and began to walk north. The 2 miles to Harper's Ridge took him an hour. The wind worked at him the entire way, finding his face, his hands, the gaps at his wrists, where his coat sleeves didn't quite reach his gloves. The cold was not dramatic. It was not aggressive in the way of a storm that announces itself. It was patient and methodical, the cold that has learned that patience achieves more than urgency. He kept moving. He found the base of the ridge. He moved along the base, looking for the fold in the hillside, the crease in the topography that he had walked past 8 times and never understood. He found it by feel more than by sight, the way the wind dropped slightly when he moved into the natural pocket it created, the way the ground underfoot changed character. He stood in front of the fold and looked at the rocks, at the natural arrangement of them, or the apparently natural arrangement. He was closer to it now than he had ever been on the search parties, closer because he was alone and moving slowly and looking at it as something he expected to find rather than something he was trying to disprove. He saw it. The arrangement of the rocks was natural in most respects, but not in all. The gap between two of the larger stones was slightly too consistent, too even to be entirely the work of weather and time. The area of ground in front of the gap was slightly too flat, slightly too clear of the debris that accumulated in every other similar hollow on the hillside. He was still looking at it when the door opened. Sigurd had heard him from a quarter-mile out. Not his voice, the wind took everything above a certain volume and rendered it white noise. But a single person moving through wind-crusted snow at altitude has a specific acoustic signature, a weight and a rhythm that is different from the wind, different from the structural sounds of the hillside itself, different from anything that belongs there. She had been listening to the sounds of the world above her for 5 days, with the heightened attention of someone whose life depends on accurately interpreting those sounds. She had heard the storm in all its phases. She had heard on the 4th day what she believed were voices distant, impossible to resolve into words, but human. She had heard on the 5th day the storm beginning to ease. And she had heard 40 minutes before the door opened the sound of one person coming. One person. Not a group. One. She had known this moment might come. She had thought about it in the long quiet hours of the 5 days underground, working through the possibilities. She had thought about Prentice standing on her roof and calling her dead. She had thought about Dorothy's folded hands on the kitchen table. She had thought about walking out of Millhaven on a Friday morning in her father's coat and not looking back. She had thought about every search party, every declaration, every judgment made loudly in the main street about what kind of girl she was and what kind of future she deserved. She had thought about her father, who had spent 3 days on this hillside preparing something he hoped she would never need, and had done it without telling her because he was not the kind of man who said the things he could simply do instead. She thought about what he would do. She opened the door. Prentice was standing 2 feet from the entrance. He was a man who had been in the cold for an hour. The frost on his beard showed it. The dark red of his face showed it. The specific stiffness of his movement showed it. But what she looked at most was his eyes. They carried something she had not seen in them before. Not humility exactly. Prentice did not come to humility easily or quickly. But the precursor to it, the specific expression of a man who has been wrong about something significant and has arrived at the location of his wrongness and is now standing in front of it. He looked at her. "I was wrong," he said. "We need help." 4 words of admission, 2 words of need. No decoration, no qualification, no attempt to soften the edges of it or distribute the responsibility for it or frame it in a way that cost him less. Sigurd looked at him for a moment, at his face, at his eyes, at the 4 words he had just said, and what it had taken to say them. Then she stepped to the side and pulled the door open as wide as it would go. "Come in," she said. He came in. He stood in the entrance tunnel, and she could see him registering the construction, the cottonwood posts, the fitted door, the angle of the passage, the packed earth walls, the work of it, the deliberateness of it. "There are more," he said, "in the meeting hall, 22 more. She looked at him. "I needed to find it first," he said. "I needed to know it was here before I asked them to walk 2 miles in this." She took that in, the reasoning of it. The fact that he had come alone first in the wind, in the cold, to know with certainty before he asked anyone else to trust what he had found. "Go back," she said. "Bring them." He looked at her with the expression of a man who wants to say something more and cannot find the words for it, and knows perhaps that the words would not be the right instrument for this moment anyway. He went back. 23 people in a space built for one. Sigurd stood at the entrance and watched them come, the group materializing out of the white, and the wind moving together, the strong ones supporting the ones who were less strong, a ragged collective of people who had been managing a deteriorating situation for 5 days and were now being asked to trust that the smoke from nowhere would prove to be something real. She saw the elderly woman being carried between 2 men. She saw a father with a child on his back, the child's arms around the man's neck, face pressed into the collar of his coat. She saw faces she recognized from Millhaven people who had been in the main street that Friday morning and had heard what Prentice said and had said nothing in response. She saw Gulliver, who had raised his hand at the February meeting and been dismissed, walking near the front of the group with the expression of a man who has been right about something at great cost to others. She saw Dorta, near the back, head down against the wind, walking with the particular posture of someone carrying something heavy that has nothing to do with what they are physically carrying. She did not look up as she approached the entrance. She did not look at Sigurd as she passed through the door. Sigurd said nothing to her. She stepped aside and let each person through and said nothing to any of them. Not because she did not have things to say, but because there was no version of what she had to say that was more useful than simply allowing them in. "Come in," she said once to the group when Prentice had brought them all to the entrance. "All of you, there is room." It was not strictly speaking true that there was room. The mathematics of 12 feet by 20 feet and 23 human bodies produced a number that was not comfortable. But comfort was not the operating standard. Warmth and survival were the operating standard, and by those standards, there was room. They filled the space the way people fill space when they have stopped having opinions about personal territory completely efficiently without complaint about the arrangement. The elderly woman got the chair by the stove. The children were placed closest to the heat. The adults arranged themselves on the floor along the walls in the passage, in every configuration that allowed one more person to fit. Sigrid moved through them. She distributed food with a particular precision of someone who has been managing a food supply carefully for months and understands the difference between adequate and insufficient at a molecular level. Smoked meat, dried corn, preserved beans from the jars on the shelf. She boiled water on the stove and made bone broth and passed it around in her 2 cups, which went around the room and came back and went around again. Nobody commented on the cups. She managed the wood supply, not burning it fast in the first relief of having enough heat, but feeding the stove at the rate that would maintain 60 degrees for as long as the wood lasted, which if she was right about her quantities was long enough. She managed the water-keeping containers moving near the stove so nothing froze, keeping the supply continuous, because 23 people in a confined space required more water than she had planned for, and she was adjusting in real time. She managed the children, giving them small tasks, things that needed doing that were within their capability, because idle children in small spaces become a problem for everyone, and purposeful children do not. Prentice sat against the north wall, his knees drawn up, and watched. He had been many things in his life. He had built things. He had organized people and resources and made decisions under pressure and executed plans against resistance. He knew what competence looked like from the inside and from the outside. He watched Sigrid Enberg move through 23 people in a space built for one, and he watched her do it with the quiet, continuous efficiency of someone who has been in charge of a difficult situation for a long time and knows exactly what needs to happen next. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the watching did not already express more completely. Einar was among them. She had not seen him in the count. She had been moving too fast, managing too many things simultaneously to track every face. She found him on her second circuit of the room against the east wall, one of the last to have come through the door, moving slowly. She brought him broth and sat on the floor beside him and looked at him carefully in the candlelight. He was tired, more than tired. Old in a way that the months since October had accelerated the chest cold of January, had taken something from him that had not returned, in the 5 days of the storm and the 2 miles in the wind had taken more Dakita. But his eyes were clear, and when they found her face, they held what they had always held. "You were ready," he said. "You taught me to be ready," she said. He shook his head, the slight economical movement of a man who disagrees with something but does not want to make an argument of it. "I taught you the technique," he said, "the method. You did the work. You made the decisions." He looked around the room, the organized stores, the stove burning at exactly the right rate, the 21 other people filling the space in the arrangement she had imposed. "This is better than ready." He drank his broth. He closed his eyes. She let him sleep. On the other side of the room, Dorta sat against the south wall with her back to the packed earth and her hands in her lap. She did not speak. She had not spoken since she came through the door. She ate what she was given without comment and drank from the cup when it came to her and sat with the particular stillness of someone who has retreated inward because the alternative, engaging with where she was and how she had come to be there, required more than she was capable of in this moment. The second day, Sigrid moved through the room, making a check water food temperature of the children. She stopped near Dorta to reach the shelf above her. Dorte looked up. Their eyes met for a moment, the first direct eye contact since the kitchen table. The folded hands, the flat, careful voice saying, "You are not my daughter. You are not my responsibility." Sigrid held her gaze for a moment. Then she took what she needed from the shelf and moved on. On the fourth day, 4 days into the 2 weeks they would spend in the hut, Sigrid was preparing the evening broth. The pot was on the stove. The bones added the water heating. She turned to get the dried herbs from the shelf and found that someone had already added wood to the stove, a precise addition, the right amount placed correctly for burn efficiency. She looked around the room. Dorta was sitting in her usual spot against the south wall. She was not looking at Sigrid, but her hands, which had been folded in her lap for 4 days, were now resting open at her sides. Sigrid looked at her for a moment. Then she turned back to the pot and continued the broth. It was enough. It was perhaps everything that was possible, and Sigrid understood this and did not ask for more and did not need more. The world would not be remade in a hut on Harper's Ridge in the winter of 1887. People were what they were, but they could become in the right circumstances slightly more than they had been, and slightly more was not nothing. On the third night, the child got sick. He was 7 years old, the boy whose father had carried him on his back through the wind and the cold. The boy who had ridden the last 2 miles of a 5-day blizzard pressed against his father's coat with his arms around the man's neck. His name was William, and he had been, for the first 2 days, a model of the kind of resilience that small children sometimes demonstrate in difficult situations: quiet, adaptable eating what was given to him and sleeping with the total commitment of a child who trusts the adults around him to have arranged things adequately. On the third night, he woke up wrong. His father felt it in the dark, the change in the quality of the boy's skin, the way heat that should be body heat had become something else, something more than body heat, something with its own agenda. He said Sigrid's name quietly, and the way he said it told her everything she needed to know about his level of alarm without making it worse by saying it out loud. She lit a candle and checked the boy. His skin was dry and hot, the particular quality of a fever that has been building for long enough that the body has committed to it fully. His breathing was fast and shallow, the breathing of a body working harder than normal to do something it should be able to do easily. His eyes were open, but not focused, moving without fixing the way eyes move in a fever when the processing behind them is occupied with something other than what the eyes are seeing. She went to the highest shelf. She took down the tin. She opened it carefully, breaking the seal she had pressed tight in February, and looked at the contents. The dried yarrow, the willow bark, both kept dry and intact in the sealed tin as Einar had specified. She made the willow bark tea first, the right amount, steeped in the right volume of boiling water for the right amount of time, the method her father had taught her when she was 9, and she had developed a fever in the dead of winter, and there was no doctor within 20 miles. The willow bark was the fever medicine. The yarrow was for the compressed, cooled water, and the dried herb combined and applied to the forehead, the wrists, the back of the neck where the blood ran close to the surface. She sat beside William through the rest of that night. She monitored his temperature with the back of her hand at regular intervals. She adjusted what she was doing based on what his body told her: more compress. When the heat peaked, the tea, given again. When the effect of the first dose began to diminish, water, given steadily, because a fever in a child requires continuous replacement of what the heat is taking. William's father sat on the other side of the boy throughout the night. He did not speak for a long time. He sat and watched Sigrid work and said nothing, and the silence of a father watching someone care for his sick child is a particular kind of silence. Not the silence of someone with nothing to say, but the silence of someone holding very still, so as not to disturb something important. Finally, toward the early morning hours, he said, "You knew to have this." "My father taught me what to keep," Sigrid said without looking up from the boy. "He taught you a great deal." "Yes," she said, "he did." The fever broke on the second day. The boy's temperature came down in the small hours of the morning. After the second day, the dry heat giving way to a light sweat, the fast, shallow breathing slowing to something within the range of normal, the unfocused eyes clearing and then closing in the genuine sleep of someone who has gotten through something difficult and is now resting on the other side of it. He opened his eyes properly in the morning and looked at Sigrid and said he was hungry. She gave him broth and half a piece of dried corn cake and watched him eat it and felt something settle in her chest that had been tightly wound since the night his father had said her name in the dark. She felt the shift in the room before she saw it clearly. Not a single moment, not a speech or a gesture or a conversation. A change in the quality of the attention being paid to her. The people in the room had been watching her since the first hour, watching her manage the food and the fire and the water and the space, and what they had seen had been working on them the way evidence works on people who are capable of being changed by evidence, slowly without announcement, arriving at new understandings by a route they could not have described, but which was entirely real. The fever and what she had done about it was simply the last piece. The thing that made every earlier piece make complete sense. On the far side of the room, Prentice was watching. He had been watching for 3 days with the particular focus of a man who was doing something more than observing, a man who was reassessing systematically everything he believed about something. She felt his gaze and looked up and met his eyes across the crowded room. He nodded once, a single nod, deliberate and complete. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to checking William's temperature. The storm broke on the morning of the 9th day of March. Not dramatically, not with the sudden clearing and the revealing sun that storms sometimes end with, as if they want to show you what they've left behind while the light is good. This storm ended the way it had built, gradually, without a single clear moment of transition. The wind reduced from 30 miles an hour to 20, then to 10, then to something that was wind in the ordinary sense rather than in the geological sense. The snow stopped. The sky lightened slowly from the uniform gray of the last 7 days towards something with variation in it, with depth, with the suggestion of blue at the edges. And then the world was quiet. The particular quiet that follows sustained violence, not peaceful, exactly, not the quiet of a place that has been undisturbed. The quiet of a place that has been worked on by something large and is now still again. Sigrid opened the door and stood in the entrance tunnel, and then in the entrance itself, and looked out at what was there. The hillside was unrecognizable. The snow had rearranged itself according to the logic of the wind, rather than the logic of the terrain, filling the hollows that should have been hollow and covering the rises that should have been visible, creating a landscape that looked like it had been made by someone who had seen a description of the original, but never the original itself. Harper's Ridge was still there. You could feel its presence under the white, the mass of it, the southward slope, the fold at the entrance, but the surface was entirely new. In the direction of Millhaven, 2 miles south, she could see damage from this distance. Roof lines that were wrong. Gaps where structures should have been. The specific flat quality of ground where a building had come down. She stood in the entrance for a long time. Behind her, 23 people were waking up, the sounds of people returning to themselves after the sustained concentration of 9 days. The sounds of people who had spent that time becoming against everything they had expected, a group that functioned. Prentice came and stood beside her in the entrance. He stood in the cold air and looked south at what was left of Millhaven and did not speak for a while. Then he said, "I owe you an accounting." "You owe me nothing," Sigrid said. "I said you were dead," he said. He said it without preamble, without the softening that a man who is not ready to be fully honest adds to difficult admissions. "I stood in front of the town council and declared it. I led search parties to find you and remove you from land. I decided you had no right to be on. I said no decent person hides the way you were hiding. I dismissed the farmer who tried to warn us about the storm." Each sentence came out separately, the way a man sets down things he has been carrying too long, one at a time, with attention to the placing of each. "And when the storm came, you opened the door." Sigrid looked at the damaged roof lines of Millhaven against the pale morning sky. "My father would have opened the door," she said. "Einar would have opened the door. That is what decent people do. It is not a difficult standard to meet. You just have to decide when the moment comes that the people in front of you matter more than what they did before they got there." Prentice was quiet for a moment. "Gulliver raised his hand at the February meeting, and he said, he told me what the cattle were doing, the hawks, the horses. He was right, and I knew he might be right, and I dismissed him anyway because admitting he might be right meant admitting I might not know something." He paused. 17 people died in that storm. "Yes," Sigrid said simply. He stood with that. He did not try to make it smaller or distribute its weight to anywhere else. He simply stood with it in the cold, looking at the damage 2 miles away, and let it be the size it actually was. The relief wagons came on the 24th of March. They came from Lincoln, a convoy of them moving across the white plain, visible from miles away, against the flat landscape, their progress slow but steady. When they reached what was left of Millhaven, the men who drove them stopped and looked at the damage and wrote things down and asked questions with the careful efficiency of people who have been sent to understand a disaster and report on it. The survivors told them what had happened, where they had been for the last 2 weeks, what had kept them alive, who had kept them alive. Every account pointed north, to the hillside where the smoke still rose. Prentice stood before the assembled survivors and the relief workers on the day the wagons arrived. He was not comfortable making speeches. He was a man built for decisions and execution, not for public declaration. But he stood in the cold March air in front of the people who had lived through the winter of 1887, and he said what he had come to say. "I owe this young woman my life," he said. "That is the plain fact of it, and I intend to say it plainly. I owe her my life, and I owe her an apology that I will not be able to make fully, no matter how long I work at it. I called her an animal. I said she was wandering the prairie like a vagrant. I said no decent person hides the way she was hiding. I led men out to find her and remove her, and I declared her dead when I failed." He looked at Sigrid, standing a few feet away, and did not look away. "She took us in anyway. She fed us. She kept us warm. She saved the life of a child with medicine she had prepared before any of us believed there was anything to prepare for." He paused. "I was wrong about everything. Wrong about who she was. Wrong about what survival looks like. Wrong about what decency is." The reporters from the Lincoln papers wrote it all down. Sigrid stood before the assembled group and said what she had to say. She did not speak about Prentice or Dorta or the months of cold and solitude and work in the dark that she had spent in the earth, while the world above her went about its business of judging her. She spoke about her father who had stood on this hillside and begun something he did not live to finish, who had wrapped his tools in canvas and buried them under a flat stone against the possibility of a future he could not control. She spoke about Einar Volstad, who had carried knowledge from a winter 50 years ago and given it to a girl who needed it at exactly the moment she needed it. She spoke about the Lakota who had known these things for generations before anyone in Millhaven had thought to ask. "You can laugh at someone's preparations," she said, looking at the faces around her. Survivors, relief workers, journalists from the Eastern papers who had come to write about the disaster and found something they had not expected to write about. You can call them crazy, call them animals, call them whatever makes you feel better about not making the same preparations yourself. But the storm always comes. It has always come and it will always come. And when it does, the ones who prepared are the ones who survive. She looked at the faces and held them. And if they are good people, and I believe most people are good people, when the circumstances stop allowing them to be, otherwise they will save you, even if you gave them no particular reason to. Dorothy Enberg left Millhaven in April. She left without ceremony. No announcement, no gathering of people to see her off because there were no people who would have gathered. She sold what remained of the Enberg homestead, the land, the structure, the livestock, what was left of the equipment, through an agent in Lincoln who came out specifically for the transaction, which told you something about her understanding of how her presence in Millhaven would be received if she attempted to conduct the transaction in person. She loaded what she was taking onto a rented wagon and headed east. Sigrid watched the wagon from the entrance to her hut on the morning it left. She watched it from the ridge, small against the flat landscape, growing smaller as it moved away, diminishing steadily into the distance, until the Nebraska plain took it, and there was nothing there. She stood on the hillside in the April air, the first real warmth of the year, the kind that actually means something, that carries in it the genuine intention of the season changing, rather than just pausing, and she felt the sun on her face and looked east until there was nothing to look at. She felt nothing that needed a name. Not satisfaction, not forgiveness, not triumph. Just the neutral fact of a thing that was over, a chapter that had closed in the way chapters close, not with a speech or a confrontation, but with a wagon growing smaller and the plain going on. Einar Volstad died in the spring of 1888. He had been weakening since January of the previous year. The chest cold that had kept him from her for 12 days had never entirely left him. It had retreated, moderated, become something manageable, but it had not gone. The effort of the storm and the 2 weeks in the hut, the cold walk, the crowded room, the sustained demand of those 2 weeks on a 72-year-old body that had been fighting something in its lungs for 2 months, had taken something from him that his body could not produce again. He knew it. He said nothing about it because saying nothing about it was consistent with how he had managed everything else by attending to what could be attended to and not giving unnecessary attention to what could not. He continued to visit Sigrid through the fall and winter of 1887 and into the spring of 1888 on the days when the weather was manageable, traveling the 5 miles on his old horse with the careful deliberateness that the journey required of him now. He sat in the chair by her stove and drank her coffee and talked about the things that interested him, the weather, the behavior of the animals he observed on his own property, the new settlement going up on the west section, the question of whether the railroad would come through and what that would mean for Millhaven and for the land around it. He told her in the last week of April that he would like to die in the chair if possible. "In the hut?" she asked. "In the chair," he said. "In the place we built. That seems right to me." She made no argument against it. He came on the last day of April, on a morning that was warm enough to suggest May had arrived early, and he sat in the chair, and she brought him coffee, and they talked for a while about nothing in particular, and then he was quiet, and she let him be quiet, and the quiet changed in quality, and she knew. She sat with him through the morning. When she went outside, the sun was overhead and warm on the hillside, and the dead grass of winter was showing the first threads of green at its base, and the sky was the high blue of a day that has decided to be beautiful and means it. She stood on the south slope of Harper's Ridge for a long time, looking out across the plain. At the distance and what was in it and what it meant to be standing on this particular piece of ground in this particular season after this particular winter. She buried him on the south slope in the sun on a day when the ground was soft enough to work without great effort. The headstone was cottonwood. She cut it herself, shaped it with her father's chisels, the same chisels she had found wrapped in canvas under the flat stone in October of 1886. She carved the inscription herself, working slowly, making sure each letter was clear and would remain clear. He taught us how to disappear. We learned how to survive. The phrase "smoke from nowhere" entered the vocabulary of the Nebraska settlers in the years after the winter of 1887. it meant something specific. Not invisible smoke, there were other words for that. Not hidden fire, that too. It meant the kind of preparation that looks to the unprepared eye like madness. The kind of work that is done in the dark that produces no result anyone can see until the moment it produces the only result that matters. The kind of readiness that cannot be demonstrated in advance and can only be proven by the event it was prepared for. When someone in those years stockpiled more than seemed necessary for their immediate circumstances, or reinforced what was already solid, or prepared for a storm that had not appeared on any observable horizon, when someone did the invisible work that made people who did not understand it laugh or shake their heads, the old-timers would say, "Remember the smoke from nowhere. Remember the girl on Harper's Ridge." Commissioner Aldous Prentice resigned his position in the fall of 1887. He did not leave Millhaven. He stayed, and in the years that followed, he helped rebuild what the storm had taken with his hands, with his money, with the organizational capacity that had always been his greatest practical ability, and that he turned now toward a different kind of order. He became, in the years after the winter, a different kind of man than he had been before it. Quieter, more careful with his certainties, more willing to sit in the back of the room when someone with experience in a thing he did not understand was speaking. More willing to raise his hand when he did not know something, which is the hardest kind of raising one's hand for a man who has spent his life believing that admission of uncertainty is a form of weakness. He was never entirely comfortable in Sigrid's presence. She never asked him to be. But he was there in the years that followed in the way that a man is there when he has decided to pay a debt he knows he cannot fully pay and has chosen to spend what he has left paying it anyway, one day at a time, without expectation of absolution. Sigrid Enberg built her homestead on Harper's Ridge. She expanded the dugout into a proper structure above ground, a house with walls and windows, and a real door that faced south in the way Einar had always recommended. She kept the underground rooms as they had always been, the root cellar. The storage, the original hut with its cottonwood beams and earthen walls, and the stove in the corner. The room where 23 people had survived the worst storm in Nebraska memory because one person had built correctly in the dark before anyone believed the storm was coming. She filed her land claim on the 30 acres of Harper's Ridge, the 30 acres of south-facing Hillside, an open grassland that no one had thought worth filing on, that her father had considered a secondary holding, that Dorthe had not known existed and had therefore not been able to claim. The filing went through the county office without objection because there was no one left who had any basis for an objection, and because the clerk at the county office had read the Lincoln Papers account of the winter of 1887 and knew exactly whose name was on the claim. She married a man named Edmund Larson the following spring. He had come west with the relief wagons as a carpenter, a Norwegian like her, like Halvard, like Einar, though his Norwegian was the newer kind, the Norwegian of a man who had left recent enough that the language was still unweathered. He had come to Millhaven to help rebuild and had found in the process of rebuilding something that changed his plans about leaving. He was not a dramatic man. He was steady and skilled and practical, with the particular quality of a carpenter who has spent his working life understanding how things fit together, not just wood and hardware, but the load-bearing requirements of structures, the way a joint distributes stress, the way a building responds to the forces applied to it over time. He understood when he looked at what Sigrid had built on Harper's Ridge, what he was looking at. He understood the engineering of it, and he understood the human achievement of it, and he could not stop thinking about it, which is in the end how a steady and practical man finds himself deciding to stay in a place he had not intended to stay. They raised 4 children on that hillside, a boy who arrived in the spring of 1889 and 3 girls who followed over the years after, each of them growing up in the house above the earth that held its warmth year-round in the underground rooms their mother had built when she was 17 and had no other option. Each child learned the old ways, not as lessons, not as the kind of taught knowledge that children receive in a classroom and file in a particular part of the mind reserved for information that is required but not urgent, as practice, as the natural knowledge of people who live on the land and pay attention to it, how to read the weather and the color of the evening sky and the behavior of the cattle and the patterns of the hawks, how to work with the land rather than against it, not asking it to be something it was not, but learning what it was and working within that. How to prepare for the storm that has not yet appeared on any visible horizon. Because preparing for what you can see is not preparation. It is simply response, and response is always late. The smoke still rose every morning, thin, gray, steady as a heartbeat. From the hillside that to a passing stranger looked empty, just the south face of a gentle ridge on the Nebraska plain, grass and rock, and the ordinary topography of a country that keeps most of its character underground. From the ground that held its warmth year-round, 55 degrees, regardless of what the air above it was doing, remembering summer with the long memory of the earth in all seasons. From the fire that a 17-year-old girl had built herself in the dark, with her father's tools and an old man's knowledge in her own hands, in the particular quality of will that does not announce itself and does not require an audience and does not wait for permission. The smoke rose, and the smoke had always risen, and it would keep rising for as long as someone kept the fire. It was never from nowhere. It was never a mystery. It was the simplest thing in the world, a fire tended carefully by someone who had understood, before most people in Millhaven were willing to understand it, that warmth does not come from what you are given. It does not come from what you inherit, or what you are granted, or what the law says you are entitled to. It comes from what you build, in the dark, before you need it, when no one believes you will last the winter. When the smoke they can see but cannot explain keeps rising anyway from nowhere, from everywhere, from the fire you built yourself. That is the only kind of warmth that lasts.